Earth's most challenging problems come from what the Earth naturally produces. However, in recent years, the Earth has had some very dramatic changes with its weather patterns. Hurricane Sandy, Typhoon Haiyan, earthquakes in Japan and Haiti are just a few examples of what Earth is capable of doing. But one of the most dangerous, most harmful contributors to the world's growing problems is us.
Food shortages, rise in sea level, drought, glaciers melting, species extinction are all results of what the human population has done. And if this pattern continues, the Earth's natural state will not only change, but also increase the Earth's dilemmas by size and quantity.
In this day and age, it has become harder to feed the world's populations. There are three global trends that are making feeding the world's population more difficult. First, billions of people are becoming more affluent and are aspiring to attain the living standards Americans enjoy every day. More meat, milk, and eggs are needed to be produced every year. Additionally, the resources required to feed these animals require more land and crops. Secondly, the world's population increases every year. Because of this annual increase, it is becoming harder to feed the additional masses of people. Finally, we are using ethanol, made from grain, as an alternative fuel source. These vast stores of grain are being used as fuel rather than food, potentially causing wide-scale starvation.
The big issue on the planet is not just the fact that we're going from 6.7 billion people today to 9.2 billion, that the population in total is increasing. The big problem on the planet is actually the number of Americans who are increasing. That is, the number of people living an American lifestyle, eating American-sized Big Macs, living in American-sized houses, driving American-sized cars, on American-sized highways, in American-sized malls. In some ways, it's a wonderful thing that so many more people in China and India, Russia and Brazil can live an American lifestyle. There's just one problem with all these carbon copies of Americans. If we, the original Americans, don't redefine in more sustainable terms what it means to be an American, we're going to heat up, choke up, smoke up, and devour up this earth.
What we're talking about here is a train wreck where it's not clear how we can feed the world with a Western diet and also supply energy with Western demands, and at the same time curb carbon dioxide. Something has to give in that picture.
Hello, Matthew. Welcome to this interview. Let's get started. What three factors are making it increasingly difficult to feed the world's population?
First would be the rising affluation and with it increased consumption of meat, milk, and eggs. Second, significant human population growth. Third, the increased use of grain to make ethanol instead of food.
China's incredibly rapid industrialization is endangering the country's water supply and therefore its food supply. This could have major global repercussions. While China may be able to avert widespread famine by paying for massive food imports from other countries, it will, in doing so, drive food prices higher around the world. making it vastly more difficult for the planet's poor countries to feed their own populations.
One of the things I noticed back in the late 80s, coming into the early 90s, was that when countries are densely populated before they industrialize, they go through some very quick stages. One is initially agricultural production goes up, but then because they're densely populated and because modernization means more roads and highways and housing expansion and so forth, then the cultivated area begins to shrink and production turns down. At the same time, the rising affluence drives demand up at an accelerating rate. So you have a country that's basically in balance. And then suddenly production starts to go down and consumption begins to rise very fast. So imports go up very fast. And you can take that model, you can apply it to Taiwan, to South Korea, countries that were densely populated before they industrialized. I used this model and applied it to China to anticipate the day in the not too distant future when China would become heavily dependent on imports. And it would happen, once it started, it would happen very fast. For the Chinese, this was a no-no. Because of the Great Famine in 1959-61, no political leader in Beijing could admit that one day China would be importing a large share of its food supply. When I did the book, Who Will Feed China, published in 1995, the response was extraordinary. I've never been exposed to a full court press by a national government before. But I could give a talk in Oslo, in Zurich, in Tokyo. If it was a public talk, there would be, and it was on food, there would be someone from China in the audience who would jump up and challenge what I had to say about China. It was just amazing. The bottom line was that the Chinese began to realize that I was right and that they were moving toward this period, and they've now reached this period. I mean, just to give 4 numbers. In 1995, China produced 14 million tons of soybeans and consumed 14 million tons of soybeans. In 2010, they produced 14 million tons of soybeans and consumed 70 million tons of soybeans. So that increase of 56 million tons means they're now importing 80% of their soybeans. That original article, Who Will Feed China, and the book that came from it probably spawned more symposia and conferences and seminars than anything I've ever written.
Okay, we're back with Matthew Dance. Now let's talk about China's global impact. How will China's rapid industrialization threaten its food supply?
Well, China's rapid industrialization is contributing to the global climate change. It's melting the Himalayan glaciers. This is feeding to the country's major rivers. If the rivers dwindle, the agricultural production will suffer.
Very interesting, Matt. What global impact will occur if China is forced to import massive amounts of food to feed its people?
Demand for food will rise, driving up prices around the world. Food in the United States will become more expensive, but the world's poorer countries will suffer the most because they will find it difficult to pay for the food they need to feed their population.
Wow, very interesting, Matt. Thank you.
Today, as in the past, environmental abuse is contributing to the demise of nations. Haiti is a case in point. Years of deforestation and associated soil erosion have left Haiti the most impoverished nation in the Western Hemisphere. Many people consider it a failed state, a country unable to ensure that its people obtain adequate food, shelter, education, and security. People believe that unchecked climate change will make it increasingly difficult for poor countries to provide for their populations, so, in the future, we will likely see more failed states resembling Haiti. How many failed states will it take before we can say that we have a failing global civilization?
Not very long ago, 60% of Haiti was covered with trees. Today, all but 2% of the forests are gone. Once, Haiti was self-sufficient in food, but as a result of uncontrolled logging and extreme soil erosion, food production could not keep up with demand. Soon, Haiti became the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Millions lived in slums. Sanitation and healthcare were almost non-existent. And local gangs forced residents to pay exorbitant prices for clean water. Eventually, political alienation and environmental stresses led to frustration and then anger.
What does Haiti mean? Well, one thing it means is it shows how you get this nexus of forces, this interplay of forces of environmental degradation, population pressures, and political instability.
You have to think of environmental stress as kind of an underlying pressure, almost a tectonic stress within the society that increases the likelihood of violence but doesn't necessarily cause it by itself. It has to come with other things such as weak governments, availability of weapons, and also deep ethnic cleavages within a society that can make violence more likely. And then all of a sudden you get a dramatic outbreak of riots in the streets.
We saw the effect of this when world grain prices tripled in late 2007, early 2008. Because Haiti could not get enough food, violent protests forced the president to resign. Today, as Haiti tries to recover from a deadly earthquake, the reality is still bleak. No matter how much disaster relief the country receives, renewal can only come when Haiti becomes strong enough to address the environmental challenges that still plague the countryside.
In rural parts of Haiti, there's a long tradition of burying a baby's umbilical cord under a tree. This ritual has always strengthened a family's sense of belonging and its attachment to the land. But what will happen when there are no more trees? Will Haitians lose their deep connection to the land?
But on a more global scale, what I worry about is that the weaker and poorer countries of the world, all those teetering on the edge of becoming failed states, won't be able to cope with the mounting problems of climate change, water shortages, and food shortages.
One of the great paradoxes of climate change is that the nations that will suffer most are the ones that are already least capable of contending with the change, that is, the poorest nations of the earth, in terms of food, resources, water, agriculture, geometrically increasing population. I sort of sense that we're at about that threshold right now.
Okay, we're here now with Nate Honorata. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be discussing failed states. Let's get started. How has environmental degradation led to poverty in Haiti?
Rampant deforestation has led to the disappearance of trees, which in turn has caused massive soil erosion. Soil washing into the sea has smothered coral reefs, So the fish depending upon the reefs for food and shelter have also vanished. Haitians cannot earn a living without farming, fishing, or forestry, without soil, fish, or trees. And since the country is so poor it cannot pay for adequate education, healthcare, and security, when the earthquake hit in 2009, Haiti had no financial resources to cope with the disaster.
Wow, very interesting.
Very interesting.
Let's move on to the next question now. Do you think other countries, especially in the developing world, are also witnessing similar environmental degradation? Do you think some might become failed states? What might happen if a lot of countries end up like Haiti?
Answers will vary. Many, if not most, of the world's developing countries are going down Haiti's path. They are seeing uncontrolled deforestation, depletion of wildlife, soil erosion, water pollution, and overfishing. Most are also seeing significant population growth left unchecked. This set of factors will lead to increased poverty and associated civil disorder.
Wow, that's some very heavy information you got there.
Yes,
We're
indeed.
gonna move on to the next question now.
Yep.
How might climate change make it more difficult for poor countries to provide for their citizens?
Climate change is affecting water supplies and rainfall patterns around the world, thus threatening agriculture. It is also killing forests and coral reefs.
Wow.
The damage created by human-caused climate change costs us money. We have to pay to clean up the aftermath of deadly storms, heat waves, drought, and flooding, and we have to pay for the loss of biodiversity that climate change is bringing about. Businesses incur costs in manufacturing for, among other things, raw materials, labor, and energy. For the most part, however, they do not have to pay for the environmental damage that they indirectly help create. Those costs typically fall on the rest of us. Paul Krugman, a noted economist, argues that this needs to change. He maintains that corporations need to take into account the environmental damage they are bringing about and put it onto their balance sheets. Primarily through their use of fossil fuels to generate energy, corporations are significant factors in global climate change, and they need to consider the resulting damage as an expense for which they are responsible. If they do, the true costs of producing the items they manufacture will become apparent. However, this will serve as an incentive for corporations to find alternative, cleaner, and less expensive ways of obtaining energy.
Okay, we're back with Nate, and we're going to talk about some economics now. Why do standard business accounting procedures fail to accurately reflect the true costs of manufacturing?
Well, they do not typically take into account the costs associated with the environmental damage that they create. If their practices pollute air, water, and soil, hurt agriculture and fisheries, and even make us sick, we generally incur the costs, not the corporations.
Well, they should really change their procedures to fix that.
Definitely.
All right, on to the next question. How do these standard accounting practices contribute to global climate change?
The primary cause of global climate change is the addition of gigantic amounts of greenhouse gases, notably carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere. A significant source of these gases is the burning of the fossil fuels, coal and petroleum. Businesses often prefer to meet their energy needs with coal and petroleum because they are convenient and cheap. The environmental damage caused by climate change, largely created by the fossil fuels, is not considered. If it were, the true cost of burning coal and petroleum would be significantly higher. As it is, we are all covering the cost of addressing climate change.
These issues really need to be worked on and changed.
In this segment, we will introduce the parable, the 29th day. The parable illustrates exponential growth, the point being that environmental crisis can suddenly and dramatically surface where no impending crisis had been apparent before. Environmental crisis, in other words, can sneak up on us unless we pay attention to what we are doing and take the timely steps to address them before they become catastrophic.
Many years ago, I wrote a book entitled The 29th Day. The title of the book comes from a French riddle that's used to teach school children exponential growth. You have a pond, and the first day it has 1 lily pad in it. The second day, 2 lily pads, and then 4, then 8. And each day the lily pads keep doubling. If the pond fills on the 30th day, when is it half full? The 29th day. Though only a children's riddle, for those who believe there's more than enough time to cope with a rapidly warming planet, let's go back and take another look at the pond. Let's say on the 20th day. Everything seems pretty normal. The number of lily pads are barely noticeable. And as the days increase, the pond becomes a sanctuary, a place dotted with pretty flowers and with more than enough room for local wildlife. By the time we reach the 29th day, there's still plenty of room. The pond is only half filled with lily pads, so maybe we'll make plans to do a bit of fishing the next day. The only problem is, on the next day, the pond is full of lily pads and will soon become a choking mass of dying vegetation, unable to provide a safe haven for wildlife. The question we now have to ask ourselves is simply this. Has our planet already reached the 29th day?
I think we've done more than reach the 29th day. I think we are well into it. We're on an accelerating curve of change.
It's always hard with climate change to know exactly where you are and when the next molecule of carbon emitted into the atmosphere will tip the whole system into all kinds of feedbacks that we can't even predict or understand.
The number one cause of global climate change is the burning of fossil fuels for energy. When we burn coal, petroleum, and natural gas, we send millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It absorbs heat. When sunlight travels through our atmosphere and strikes the Earth, much of it converts to heat and radiates back into space. CO2, however, absorbs the heat and keeps it from escaping. Other human activities cause huge amounts of other greenhouse gases, like methane, to enter the atmosphere as well. This, in a nutshell, is why global climate is occurring. This segment makes the point that people around the world are concerned about the atmospheric CO2 rise and are taking steps to stop it. Unfortunately, world leaders seem to be lagging behind public sentiment. In 2010, at a United Nations conference on climate change in Copenhagen, Denmark, they failed to come to an agreement on how to combat climate change. The film takes the view that any solution to this crisis will have to include measures that make burning fossil fuels more expensive so that people have the incentive to find alternative energy sources.
We stand on the foundations that have been laid out by those who came before us, the foundations of change. As we develop and formulate our understanding of our purpose, we learn and grow with the help of those who guide us. By looking within ourselves, we can learn to speak and live from our hearts. In doing, we will rise up and touch the sky. Live from our
Food shortages have led to most of the examples of civilization collapse throughout human history. The Sumerians in the ancient Middle East, the classic Mayan civilization in mid-America, and the great Zimbabwe culture in Africa are all examples of societies that came undone because of environmental abuse, leading to famines. The fates of these ancient civilizations are warning signs, showing us what might happen today if we likewise damage our environment so that food becomes scarce and great numbers of people go hungry.
united, love and understanding becomes there. We stand united, looking at the new horizon with all possibilities lying before us. All possibilities.
Are we capable of confronting global climate change before it's too late? The crisis demands immediate action on a scale that we have not yet achieved. Yet, we believe that we can rise to the challenge. He looks at how quickly the United States mobilized to produce the vehicles, ships, and armaments needed to achieve victory in World War II, and concludes that we can put forth a similar effort today. We have the tools at our disposal to make this happen. We just need the will.
The United States pulled together and achieved victory in World War II against formidable opponents. Do you think we have the leadership, determination, confidence, and public spirit to tackle the colossal challenge of global climate change in similar fashion?
This is all